During the current budget year, we hope to invest and reinvest approximately $3 billion of surplus and investment income back into the Heritage Fund, increasing its value to almost $25 billion. That's up from $17 billion just a couple of years ago. This puts us back on the right track. In addition, I have instructed our finance minister to limit government spending to below the legislated rate cap of inflation plus population growth, not just during lean years with lower oil prices as we expect next year, but also in years when high oil and natural gas prices result in billions of surplus provincial dollars. Instead of spending all that non-renewable surplus cash on the wants of today, we will be fiscally disciplined, invest in the Heritage Fund annually, strategically pay down maturing debt, and slowly but surely wean our province's budget off the volatile roller coaster of resource revenues. In my view, our province has one last shot at getting this right. We still have several decades during this global energy transition where nations will desperately need our oil and gas resources for their people, and we will provide it to them with the most advanced environmental technology on Earth. So despite this coming year's predicted global economic slowdown, I believe our province is on the cusp of an unprecedented and prolonged energy resource boom, one that will include both hundreds of billions in investment and tens of thousands of new jobs, not only in oil and gas production, but also in designing and building the most advanced emission reduction technologies on Earth. It is going to be an exciting time for our province and for Canada, especially once we finally get a federal government that acts like a strategic partner rather than a delusional adversary. Prior to the end of this year, our government will publicly release a long-term financial plan charting a path to a heritage fund of between $250 and $400 billion by the year 2050. 2050 is also our target for achieving a carbon-neutral economy. Meeting these two goals simultaneously with Alberta technology, determination, and ingenuity will leave an invaluable legacy for future generations of Albertans and Canadians. There is no doubt in my mind we are capable of achieving these goals, but we need to start today and stick with it fervently, year after year. I ask for your support as our government commits itself to placing our province on this path to prosperity that will last long after our last barrel of oil has been produced. We, our children, and their children deserve nothing less.
You can watch the whole thing on her Twitter feed, or we'll have a link to it on the page. I think she sounds great. I think she sounds smart. I think she sounds conservative, but also futuristic. I don't agree with every word of what she says in the video. She talks about, carbon offsets or a zero carbon economy. I think that's baloney. But I think her comments about now are pretty good. Let's ask someone who follows this very closely, our friend Lorne Gunter, senior columnist with the Post Media newspapers in Edmonton. Lorne, great to see you again. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Happy to be here.
I like the fact that Danielle Smith is going straight to the people, and I think every conservative politician should do that because I think too often the mainstream media acts as a kind of filter. Putting that, outside comment aside, what about the heart of her message? Do you agree with it? Do you think it's smart for Alberta? Do you think it's politically popular? What do you think of her message today?
I think it's good. I do think it's sensible. It's not as dramatic as it might have been. For instance, it doesn't acknowledge that the provincial government has a spending problem. It doesn't matter which party is in office, whether it's the Conservatives or the NDP or now the UCP, they all spend more and more and more money every year. In a column I have today in the Edmonton Sun and the Calgary Sun, I talk about the fact that in 2013, Alison Redford, who was the PC premier at the time, talked about the bitumen bubble and how it was impossible to avoid deficits when we had to rely on oil and gas revenues. And then in 2016, Rachel Notley talked about the revenue roller coaster and how it was impossible to avoid deficits because we have to rely on oil and gas revenues. And they have all done this. I mean, I remember going back to Don Getty whining and whinging about the fact that they couldn't count on non-renewable resource revenues. That's what they call the line in the budget every year, non-renewable resource revenues. Because some years, as Smith pointed out this year, it's like $16 or $17 billion in revenues, whereas 2 or 3 years ago, it was $3.
Yeah.
It's tricky for sure. But nobody ever looks at the fact that 20 years ago, they were spending just a little more than half per capita adjusted for inflation of what they're spending now. So they've increased spending by about 80% over 20 years in real dollars. And they never acknowledged that. So were there things about her speech that I didn't care for? Yeah, I mean, I think it could have been much more transparent that way. But in general, she said, look, we're not going to do this with taxes. We're not going to find some stability in our revenues by putting in, for instance, a provincial sales tax. Now, she didn't specifically mention the PST, but that's always, no matter who the premier is, that's always one of the options that's thrown out there is, if only Alberta had a PST, it would all be okay. That's ridiculous. So what she said was, over the next 25 years, we're going to try and hold spending to the increase in inflation and population. If there's any surplus, we'll use it to pay down debt and reduce debt servicing costs, and then put more into the Heritage Fund. And I think this was one of the keys in her address. She said, if the Heritage Fund had simply been left alone, if we had reinvested the interest from the Heritage Fund, it was about $12 billion when Peter Lougheed created it in the late 70s and early 80s. If we'd left that $12 billion alone, the interest from that money plus the investments that it funded would now be giving Alberta about $250 billion in the fund, which would generate up to $25 billion a year in interest and investment income, which would even out all the problems that they have with non-renewable resource revenue. So this is sensible, and I agree with you entirely that she accepts that Albertans might not know this, but she trusts that they're intelligent enough to understand it if she explains it to them. I mean, she did. You talked about the one she did a couple of weeks ago on transgender issues. She did another one in January, where she talked about all of the different environmental initiatives that the Trudeau government has and how that was hurting Alberta. And it was about 4 minutes long, I think 4.5 minutes long, and I thought it was very good. But like you, I think the production qualities needed to be worked on. I told her to stop walking. She made me motion sick watching that one because she never stopped walking. She walked around the legislature ground and she stopped to walk. But it was intelligent and it was full of all sorts of really good information. And so was the one on Wednesday night in the province-wide address.
Yeah, those are great points. I haven't checked this math recently, but I bet it's true. I bet that the province of Alberta, under a so-called conservative premier, that's what the UCP stands for, United Conservative Party, I bet they spend more per capita than the NDP government of British Columbia or the fake conservatives in Ontario. I bet, in fact, Lorne, I bet you know this off the top of your head, I bet that Danielle Smith spends more proportionately than Rachel Notley did. No.
I think they're actually about even. But
even that is shocking. Even that
they haven't ratcheted up. Thatcher used to say this about conservative governments in England, is that they would come in and they would hold the line on spending done by the Labour governments before them, but no one ever ratcheted down this until she came along. And aside from the first 4 years of Ralph Klein's tenure, nobody has ratcheted back spending.
Yeah, this first time 30 years ago was the only time in Alberta history they actually cut, and they cut by a minuscule amount. So, by the way,
the first 4 years, the first 3 years, they did a tremendous amount. They cut 18% in real dollars. Like that was huge spending that they cut back. But then thereafter, Ralph just spent, and by the time he left office, they were spending the same amount per capita that they had spent under Don Getty, who was considered the spendthrift at that point. But ever since that time, they've crept up. Like I call it expenditure creep, because every year the expenditures go up until Kenny and Smith came in, and they've pretty much held steady. And I'm keen to see next week will be the provincial budget. We'll see whether or not they hold steady again, because they've made all sorts of very expensive promises, like more money for first responders, more money for healthcare. There's tons of money in the healthcare budget in Alberta.
Yeah,
but they just have to fire about 10,000 bureaucrats whose jobs are not particular. It's not particularly obvious what the hell they're doing. You could find a lot of money there. You could find billions of dollars by reducing the amount of bureaucracy there. So let's see if they can do that. Let's see if they can hold spending at the natural increase of population and inflation, and then find more money to spend on services by making efficiencies in the bureaucracy.